Cornel West emphasizes that to understand race in America, one must first confront its historical roots. Race is not a neutral biological fact but a social construct, invented to justify exploitation, oppression, and inequality. From the earliest days of colonial America, ideas of racial hierarchy were codified to rationalize slavery and the dispossession of indigenous peoples. He reminds us that slavery was not merely a labor system, it was a moral crime disguised as law, embedding a worldview in which black people were seen as property rather than human beings. The legacy of this dehumanization echoes across centuries, shaping contemporary systems of inequality. The post-slavery era did not end racial oppression. The rise of Jim Crow laws, segregation, and violent enforcement of white supremacy reinforced a society in which race determined opportunity, safety, and social standing. West stresses that these systems were not accidental but deliberate efforts to maintain power. Even after the civil rights movement, structural racism persisted. Disparities in housing, education, healthcare, and criminal justice illustrate that the past is never past, it continues to shape lives today. West argues that understanding this historical continuity is crucial to addressing modern racial issues. West also examines the psychological impact of history. Generations of oppression instill both trauma and resilience. Knowledge of one's history can empower, but ignorance of it leaves communities vulnerable to manipulation and internalized oppression. He highlights the importance of stories, narratives, and historical memory. The media, education, and cultural institutions play a role in either concealing or revealing the truths of racial history. West calls for honesty in recounting America's racial past, because moral and social healing cannot occur without truth. The construction of race was always intertwined with economics. Slavery, land theft, and labor exploitation created wealth for some while systematically denying it to others. West points out that economic inequality and racial oppression are inseparable in America's history. West also notes the legal system's complicity. Laws were often written to protect the interests of the powerful while reinforcing racial hierarchies. Even today, remnants of these laws manifest in unequal sentencing, policing, and political representation. Religion played a dual role. Some religious institutions justified racial hierarchies, while others became sites of resistance. West emphasizes that understanding the moral contradictions in religious history is key to understanding America's racial landscape. Education, too, has historically reinforced racial hierarchies. Curriculum, access, and opportunities were racially segregated, producing generations denied full knowledge and critical tools to challenge oppression. West stresses the moral responsibility to correct these inequities. Cultural representation further entrenched racial myths. Art, literature, and media often depicted Black Americans through demeaning stereotypes, shaping public perception and self-perception alike. West insists that dismantling these narratives is essential for genuine equality. The struggle against racism, West observes, is ongoing. Historical knowledge equips individuals and communities with the moral lens to recognize injustice and mobilize change. Without historical awareness, society risks repeating the same errors. West stresses that history is not merely about the past, it is a guide for moral action in the present. Understanding how race was constructed and enforced illuminates the mechanisms that continue to operate today. Finally, he argues that history provides both a warning and a roadmap. By studying racial oppression in America, we can see how power functions and how resistance arises. Awareness empowers people to act with justice, compassion, and courage. Ultimately, West insists that confronting history honestly is a moral imperative. To ignore it is to leave society vulnerable to perpetuating injustice, while reckoning with it opens the possibility of collective healing and genuine democracy. Cornel West teaches that race is more than social categories, it touches the moral and spiritual life of the nation. Racism is not merely a policy issue but a reflection of ethical failure, corrupting hearts and communities. The meaning of race, therefore, is inseparable from questions of justice, love, and conscience. He argues that the moral imagination is required to see racism for what it truly is, a distortion of human relationships. It is the refusal to recognize the inherent dignity of others, reducing people to stereotypes, commodities, or obstacles. West emphasizes that racism wounds both the oppressed and the oppressor. For those marginalized, it imposes fear, limitation, and a sense of invisibility. For those who wield power, it encourages cruelty, entitlement, and moral blindness. Both sides suffer a loss of humanity. He often calls on Americans to imagine the world as it ought to be, not just as it is. The moral imagination allows one to see the possibilities for justice, reconciliation, and healing beyond entrenched hierarchies. Without this capacity, society remains trapped in cycles of prejudice and inequality. Racism, West notes, thrives on moral disengagement. It is sustained when individuals ignore injustice, rationalize harm, or remain indifferent to suffering. He emphasizes that ethics must guide social critique. Facts alone are insufficient to foster change. The moral imagination also fuels empathy. West insists that one cannot combat racial oppression without the ability to feel with others, to inhabit their pain, and to respond with compassion. Love is not sentimental but a radical moral force that challenges indifference. Art, literature, and music play crucial roles in cultivating the moral imagination. West cites Black artistic traditions as essential means of expressing truth, confronting oppression, and inspiring collective reflection on race and justice. Education, according to West, must awaken moral consciousness. Knowledge of history, philosophy, and social conditions should provoke moral reflection, not mere memorization. A society that teaches only facts without cultivating conscience remains complicit in injustice. West argues that confronting racial inequality requires courage. The moral imagination is not passive, it demands action, resistance, and accountability. To witness injustice without response is itself an ethical failure. Religion, spirituality, and prophetic traditions shape moral imagination as well. West highlights how Black religious thought has historically called for justice, dignity, and ethical vigilance against oppression. He warns that the moral imagination must contend with societal distractions, consumerism, entertainment, and media spectacles that numb conscience and obscure ethical responsibility. Awareness must be cultivated deliberately. West emphasizes that racism distorts perception. It teaches people to misread character through color, to equate difference with threat. The moral imagination corrects this distortion by insisting on a vision of shared humanity. Community is essential in cultivating moral awareness. Individual reflection is necessary, but collective engagement strengthens moral clarity, accountability, and courage to confront systemic injustice. Ultimately, West portrays the moral dimension of race as a call to inner and outer work. One must cultivate empathy, resist moral indifference, and actively participate in the struggle for justice. Race is not only a social fact but a moral test for the nation. Through this lens, racial justice becomes a matter of conscience as well as policy, demanding both action and reflection grounded in love, courage, and ethical clarity. West emphasizes that race is deeply intertwined with identity, shaping both how individuals see themselves and how society perceives them. For Black Americans, race is often a lens of visibility and vulnerability, dictating social possibilities and constraints. He notes that internalized oppression is a persistent challenge. Constant exposure to stereotypes, discrimination, and cultural commodification shapes self-perception, sometimes leading to doubt, shame, or the need to perform socially acceptable identities. At the same time, race can be a source of strength and resilience. It offers a shared history, culture, and collective memory that empowers individuals and communities to resist oppression and maintain dignity. Pride in racial identity can serve as a foundation for solidarity. West warns against reducing identity to superficial markers or media images. The commodification of Black culture, music, fashion, language, often detaches it from historical and spiritual roots, turning heritage into consumable products. He emphasizes that authentic identity requires moral and spiritual grounding. One must cultivate integrity, critical consciousness, and ethical purpose to navigate a society that often devalues Black life. Identity cannot be merely performative, it must be lived. The psychological impact of racism is profound. West stresses that racial stress affects mental health, self-esteem, and the ability to participate fully in civic life. Recognizing and addressing these effects is essential for empowerment and community renewal. Community networks play a key role in shaping identity. Families, schools, churches, and cultural institutions provide spaces to develop pride, purpose, and resilience. West views these networks as essential moral resources. He highlights the danger of assimilation without critique. While integration can offer opportunities, it may also demand conformity to values and norms that erase cultural distinctiveness and moral perspectives. Authenticity requires balancing participation with critical awareness. West emphasizes storytelling as a tool for identity formation. Personal and communal narratives preserve history, affirm worth, and challenge dehumanizing portrayals. Stories of struggle and triumph anchor self-perception in truth rather than stereotype. Race also interacts with class, gender, and power, complicating identity further. West notes that intersectionality matters in understanding how individuals navigate society and resist systemic oppression. He encourages young people to embrace both critique and pride. Recognizing societal prejudice should not lead to despair, but to courage, self-knowledge, and determination to create meaningful lives. West stresses that identity is dynamic, not fixed. It evolves through reflection, struggle, love, and engagement with society. Authentic identity emerges from dialogue between self and community, past and present, struggle and aspiration. He critiques media's role in distorting identity, arguing that overexposure to stereotypical images can shape aspirations and self-conception in ways that undermine authenticity and moral vision. Ultimately, West portrays racial identity as a site of both vulnerability and liberation. Navigating it requires courage, consciousness, and moral imagination. Identity is not a trap but a foundation for resistance, love, and justice. Cornel West frames race not only as a challenge but as a call to action, a moral and political responsibility. Understanding race in America should inspire a vision for justice, equality, and societal healing. He stresses that racial justice is not merely legal or political reform, it is a moral project. Laws alone cannot heal centuries of oppression or restore dignity. Ethical commitment and love must accompany structural change. West advocates for reconciliation grounded in truth. Acknowledging past and present injustices honestly is essential for moral repair. Without truth-telling, efforts at reconciliation are shallow and ineffective. Education, he insists, must cultivate both knowledge and conscience. Citizens should understand systemic racism, historical oppression, and their own roles in perpetuating or resisting injustice. Awareness must lead to action. He emphasizes the importance of community engagement. Change requires collective responsibility, solidarity, and activism. Justice is not achieved individually but through concerted moral and civic effort. West links racial justice to economic justice. Reparative measures, equitable opportunities, and dismantling structural barriers are necessary for meaningful equality. Without addressing material conditions, racial reconciliation remains incomplete. He draws from spiritual and prophetic traditions, emphasizing love as a transformative force. Justice without love risks cold legality, while love without justice risks passivity. Both must coexist for real social transformation. West stresses moral courage. Challenging systemic racism requires standing against entrenched power, enduring criticism, and acting despite risk. Prophetic voices are essential to guide society toward ethical truth. Dialogue across racial lines is crucial. Listening, empathy, and humility foster understanding, reduce prejudice, and build alliances for change. West advocates for sustained engagement, not superficial gestures. He warns against complacency. Partial reforms, token gestures, or symbolic recognition cannot substitute for deep structural and moral transformation. Society must confront root causes of inequality. West views reconciliation as both restorative and preventive. Healing past wounds strengthens moral resilience and reduces the likelihood of future oppression. Justice is thus both a remedy and a safeguard. Art and culture play a role in reconciliation, serving as spaces for reflection, empathy, and collective memory. Music, literature, and performance communicate truths that words alone often cannot. Ultimately, West's vision situates racial justice within a larger moral framework. Freedom, dignity, and love are inseparable from equality. Society must cultivate both ethical awareness and civic responsibility. Racial reconciliation, in West's terms, is not a utopian fantasy but a practical moral project. It demands patience, courage, love, and truth, the same virtues that make democracy and community meaningful. By embracing this vision, West believes that America can move beyond division and oppression toward a more just, humane, and spiritually grounded society. Race, properly understood, becomes a guide for moral renewal rather than a source of despair.